He says housing is not his job either. Well, the housing crisis is getting worse. If it's not his job to do anything, any of these things, what is his job?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I find it rather rich, Madam Speaker, with all due respect to the member, when that party's Leader of the Opposition, a responsibility to put forward constructive policy, when he was in opposition, in government, as Minister responsible for housing, put forward a plan, $300 million, less than 100 homes built. His plan on housing today is full of holes. He taxed builders, for example. Nothing will get built under his watch, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Madam Speaker, they spent almost $90 billion to double the price of a home, to double the price of rent, to double the price of a mortgage. In Toronto, it now takes 80% of what Canadians take home to keep a roof over their head. More Liberal spending equals higher inflation, which leads to higher interest rates, which leads to higher mortgages. So how many Canadians have to be in jeopardy of losing their homes before the Liberals stop spending, stop raising taxes, and actually start building homes?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, Canadians are having a difficult time. That's why during the pandemic we put forward emergency programs that sustain the economy, individuals and families, when that party didn't want to do any of those things. Today we see a government that's put forward a plan to get more homes built. How? In partnership with provinces, with municipalities. That's how we're going to get things done. Not by measures on the other side that instill nothing but fear in the wider Canadian economy and the wider Canadian society. That's not responsible leadership, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Home building is actually down just because they have a fancy program or a new acronym every month. It doesn't mean that any of this is working. The government had a plan in 2015 to build housing on surplus land. Do you know how many homes they've built since 2015? 13. That's less than 2 a year. Liberal MPs have flipped more houses than that since 2015. It's been 8 years. We need shovels in the ground and not pies in the sky. So will they finally support a common sense Conservative plan to actually build homes Canadians can afford?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Common sense. It's a shame she wasn't at yesterday's Finance Committee, Madam Speaker, where witnesses from the Ministry of Finance confirmed that if their idea for housing was to be put in place, less homes would be built compared to our particular plan. It's a plan that takes taxes off. The GST comes off, for example. That incents greater building, Madam Speaker. Combine that with the approach they've taken to municipalities, to provinces, when it comes to ending things like exclusionary zoning. We want to work with those municipalities. We're doing that through the Housing Accelerator Fund. That will continue. The result will be 200,000 to 300,000 homes built as a result.
The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you. Yesterday in the Finance Committee, this government's own department told the Finance Committee that in fact in 2018 they warned the Liberal government of an impending housing crisis, yet they did nothing. Incredibly, CMHC officials went on to say that the policies currently employed by the federal government are not sufficient to solve the housing problem. If, in fact, this government's own department doesn't believe in this Liberal government, why should Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Infrastructure's Housing, Infrastructure and Communities. I knew there was one in there.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would remind my honourable colleague to look at the actual record and to look at the actions of that opposition leader, who this summer, while presenting himself as some sort of champion of the working class, stood in front of a Canadian's home, took a video, and called that home a shack. If he is serious about dealing with affordability and the housing crisis and the supply crisis that underpins it, I want to hear from him and his party serious plans along the lines of what we've presented on this side. We're going to continue to fight for Canadians.
So I want to remind members, if they want to have conversations while answers and questions are being asked, they should take their conversations outside. The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Madam Speaker, Canada's problems are real. We have incredible food bank usage. We have housing costs doubling. Millions of Canadians cannot afford their own homes, yet this side decides to play games. Back when the leader of the opposition was housing minister, housing was affordable in the country. So when will this government finally get serious, remove the gatekeepers, balance the budget so Canadians can keep their homes?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, he's quite correct. That side does play games. You know what else they do? They also vote against tax cuts for the middle class. They also vote against child care for kids. They vote against dental care for kids. Discussions of pharmacare are happening at this time. That side wants to entertain none of it. At a time when Canadians are facing real challenges of affordability, government can be there to help. This government has put serious measures on the table. It's having an effect. We're going to continue to do that. They should wake up and come to the party.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Madam Speaker, 97%. That's the share of income a household would need to cover home ownership costs now in Vancouver. This from a new RBC report, which says housing affordability in most major Canadian cities is near all-time worst levels. The Prime Minister also holds the all-time record for incurring more debt during his 8 years than all other Prime Ministers combined. Housing is less affordable than ever. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister finally stop his inflationary spending so Canadians can keep a roof over their head?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I remind the honourable member, Madam Speaker, that Canada has the lowest deficit and debt in the G7. But times remain hard. We see that. We understand that. On housing affordability, what are we doing? The supply crisis that underpins the housing crisis in front of the country is one that requires building. That's why we've lifted GST for the purposes of rental construction on apartments. That's why we've made changes to the borrowing limit of the Canada Mortgage Bond. I don't want to get into the technical details because they are vast. The result is more homes built for Canadians. That's what we're going to continue to do.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, Madam Speaker, the OECD says in the G7 that Canada has the biggest gap between housing prices and Canadian wages. The Finance Minister said her plan to bring down inflation is working, and yet it has soared to 4%. Mortgage interest costs have also soared now to 31%. So it's no wonder Mortgage Pro's recent survey showed 48% of young people say they've given up on ever owning a home. Now, this NDP Liberal government spending is driving up inflation, which is driving up interest rates, which is driving up mortgage interest costs. Will the Prime Minister finally stop his inflationary spending so Canadians can keep a roof over their head?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
There we go again, Madam Speaker. The contradictions just speak for themselves, but I'll highlight them for you. In July of 2022, we had inflation at over 8%. That is now down to 4%. Certainly not low enough, but we see progress on that front, Madam Speaker. I also hear all sorts of ideas from the other side, Madam Speaker, that won't have a tangible impact in terms of affordability. Let's just take pensions, by the way. Yes. I've heard nothing from that side at all with respect to Premier Smith's pension plan that would deplete the fund by 53%. Combine that with their focus or lack of focus on EI, they voted against all these measures that will